Look at this. This is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. So at the bottom here, every single one of those lines is a biblical verse. Now, the length of the line is proportionate to how many times that verse is referred to in some way by some other verse. So you say, well, this is the first hyperlinked book. And there's 65,000 cross-references, and that's what this map shows. And so that's a great visual representation of the book. And then you can see, well, why is it deep? Why is the book deep? Well, just imagine how many pathways you could take through that, right? I mean, you'd just journey through that forever. You'd never, ever get to the end of it.
Hey everybody, Secular Spirit here, and that clip is an excerpt from a lecture by none other than my favorite pseudo-theist, Jordan Peterson, from a biblical series he did a few years ago. As some of you, my regular viewers, might know, I'm making more of an effort to learn about Christianity, its pros and its cons. And that's how I discovered a TikTok channel by a biblical scholar named Dan McClellan. He mainly tackles the erroneous claims made by Christian TikTok channels. And in one video, he shares his insights into the issues with what Peterson is talking about here after a Christian TikToker shared Peterson's lecture on his channel. So without any further ado, this video will be my analysis of Dan McClellan's analysis of a Christian TikToker's highlighting of Jordan Peterson's analysis of the Bible. Phew, the internet is a magical place.
Watch this video with me. This is amazing.
All right, let's see it.
Yes, this is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. So at the bottom here, every single one of those lines is a biblical verse.
It's not a biblical verse, it's a biblical chapter.
Now, the length of the line is proportionate to how many times that verse is referred to in some way by some other verse.
No, the length of the line is how many verses are in that chapter.
So you say, well, this is the first hyperlinked book, right? I'm dead serious about that. You can't click and get the hyperlinks, obviously, but it's a thoroughly hyperlinked book.
So it's kind of hard to see this biblical visualization everyone's referring to in that video. So here it is a bit bigger. I also left a link for it in the video description if you want to check it out. And now let's watch a bit more.
So the Bible is absolutely a highly self-referential text, and there are many good reasons for this. It is a collection of the authoritative literature of a specific historical community and its descendants that accumulated over the course of many centuries. And from its initial compilation down to the very last text that was written, the goals were to generate and curate a sense of shared identity, a sense of community, and a sense of a relationship with deity. And so the compilation and accumulation of new text focused on that macro narrative of telling the story of the relationship of God to their people. And so new layers that were added on were more likely to gain purchase and to remain a part of the corpus to the degree that they could create ties to that past.
Now, the running joke about Jordan Peterson is how astonishing it is that someone who appears to be going through a never-ending and very public emotional breakdown has a best-selling self-help book. No, I should correct myself. He has 2 best-selling self-help books somehow. But what he shares here is something that resonates with a lot of believers, in this particular case with Christians. The same kind of mentality can be found with Muslims when they talk about the Quran. And what is that something? What is that mentality? Well, it's assigning meaning and significance to something where there might not necessarily be any intended significance. Or to say it in simpler terms, it's finding something that isn't actually there. And isn't that really organized religion in a nutshell? Beyond Peterson getting some very basic details about that Bible visualization wrong, I think what matters most here is the biblical scholar's nuanced explanation of how Peterson's overall perception of this biblical visualization is off. And that has to do with the biases, the assumptions that are at the foundation of the religious beliefs of many Christians. A Christian like the TikToker who highlighted this Peterson clip will view all those pretty colored arcs and the number of cross-references, more than 60,000 of them, and exclaim that this is a blatant sign of the divine inspirations of the Bible. And a few of them may even use the word miracle to describe all these connections in the Bible. Some Muslims do the same basic thing with the Quran. They'll claim it has a mathematical code in it, particularly for things that are opposites. So they'll claim that the word for life, al-hayat, is mentioned 145 times, the same number of times as the word for death, al-Maut is mentioned. But they go much wilder too, claiming that the Quran actually contains things like the escape velocity needed to leave Earth. I kid you not, this is something real I found on Facebook. I learned a few of these examples when I was Muslim, and these numerical miracles are often used by Muslims to prove the Quran is divine. But for me, now that I'm no longer a believer, I've shed the underlying assumption that Islam is true or that the Abrahamic God is real. Once you shed these assumptions, you'll re-examine a book like the Bible or the Quran with a fresh and skeptical perspective. Let's look at it from the perspective of a non-believer, and to Christians watching, assume this book of all these cross-references isn't the Bible, but some other holy book of some other religion. Is it that surprising that so many cross-references will be found when we consider that generation upon generation of believers, scholars, monks, lay people are reading and scrutinizing the same pages constantly, over and over again, searching for new layers of meaning and connection? And keep in mind too, that these people are not doing so objectively for the most part. They are believers seeking to affirm their faith. And as McClellan explains, what if there is nothing that special about some of the references to the older parts of the Bible, beyond newer writers wanting their writings to have more of a sense of legitimacy?
The way this chart is put together, it's not identifying connections that were understood or intended by the authors and editors. I would argue that the majority of these connections are connections that have been conjured up since the completion of the Bible. We've had over 2,000 years to look at these texts and come up with different ways to draw connections to make these texts more meaningful and more useful and more significant to us.
So I realized that more than anything else, rather than indicate any divine significance of the Bible, this cross-reference visualization example merely reveals century upon century of Christian obsession with validating their beliefs of the Bible's divine significance. It's a crucial difference because the latter is clearly man-made, although I'm sure that there will be believers who will argue that all those thinkers were divinely inspired, or tapping into the divine when identifying these 60,000 plus cross-references. And when McClellan talks about how many of the connections weren't intended by the original writers, I can imagine some believers will also say they were just unaware of how they were divinely inspired. There's a lot of blind faith underlying the interpretation of the significance of these cross-references. And what is the nature of a lot of these cross-references too? How many of them are just blatantly conjuring up connections with very little solid ground to build on? To name one example, a lot of Christians say that Isaiah 53 is a prophecy about Jesus, when it mentions he who was despised and rejected by mankind, who took up our pain and bore our suffering, while some scholars say it is actually referring to the Jewish people, not Jesus.
And the way the creators of this chart describe their methodology indicates that they're not looking for explicit or clear linguistic cross-references. This is how they define cross-references. They are conceptual links, not direct linguistic references, but conceptual links between verses, connecting locations, people, phrases, etc., found in different parts of the Bible. So the idea is not necessarily this is where one author referred to another author or their text. This is here's where we can draw a connection between something that is said here and something that is said over there. Maybe it's the notion that this is the fulfillment of some prophecy that scholarship agrees isn't really a prophecy to begin with, and that scholars have never suggested was intended to function as the fulfillment of some earlier prophecy. This chart connects directly to Genesis 1 pretty much every reference to creation or creator found anywhere in the text, whether or not it is clear that it was intended to refer to the events of Genesis 1. So this is not an illustration of the hyper-self-referentiality of the Bible. This is really an illustration of how much we have read into the text and how many connections we have imposed upon the text.
Conceptual links, which to me means they are very loose, very open to interpretation, and much like beauty, they are in the eye of the beholder. To give you an example that might clarify what I'm trying to point out here, if you take a lengthy and complex work of fiction, like The Lord of the Rings, for example, and devote countless resources over the course of centuries to finding or perhaps manufacturing is the better word, connections, and interpreting new meanings in its pages, you're bound to come up with a lot of stuff.
If you take a complex piece of literature like a Shakespeare play, there's no end to the number of interpretations that you can make of it. You know, you can interpret each word, you can interpret each phrase, each sentence, each paragraph, you can interpret the entire play.
Now imagine if you believe that The Lord of the Rings was divinely inspired by a god who created and loves you, and who has a plan for you. Well, you're going to have added motivation there, won't you? Soon enough, we'd have a cult worshipping the Fellowship and building shrines to Gandalf or Frodo or whoever, and parents scaring kids into behaving with stories of Sauron and evil orcs. And to bring this back to the numerical miracles of the Quran that I mentioned earlier, centuries of Muslim obsession and hyper-analysis have similarly dug into every possible kind of connection. For me, the matching of some words like life and death, whether it's coincidence, generous interpretation, or intentional, doesn't discount the possibility of a human author or authors. And the more extreme and complex proofs, well, again, I'm sure you can find all sorts of potentially freaky connections if you take any long book and fixate on it for millennia.
Well, just imagine how many pathways you could take through that.
Look at
Right?
that.
I mean, you just journey through that forever. You'd never ever get to the end of it.
Yes, the Bible can be conceptualized as the world's most complex choose-your-own-adventure game. But again, this chart primarily is illustrating just how creative we have become after 2,000 years of reading the Bible. And I don't know if Dr. Peterson is subtly intending to make this argument, but absolutely none of these data demand or even point in the direction of anything other than a perfectly natural origin for the Bible.
And with those final words from our biblical scholar, are you ready for a twist? He is Mormon. Much like my feelings on religious historian Karen Armstrong, another pseudo-theist I've talked about in the past on this channel, I'm astounded that someone like Dan McClellan, who has spent a lifetime meticulously researching the Bible and dispelling many of the divine claims that surround it, would be a follower of Mormonism, which I haven't talked about much on this channel, but which requires a whole bunch of leaps of faith to believe in it. For me, I'm curious about how believers examine, or perhaps don't examine, their own faith and life philosophy. I used critical thinking and skepticism to see the weaknesses and the reasons for why I believed in Islam. And to me, I can't help but wonder how a religious scholar who understands the man-made development of Christianity better than most would still believe in a religion. Now, as far as I can tell, he purposefully avoids talking about his faith on his channel, but he has claimed he uses the same critical eye he uses regarding the Bible on Mormonism as well. I'm unsure about that, but I still highly recommend you check out his content, which I've linked to in the video description. And do let me know more about him and his faith if you're familiar with his work. And as always, if you enjoyed this content, please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm Secular Spirit, and I'll be back soon.